Well, howdy, everyone, and welcome back to the Rancher Podcast. I want to first, of course, apologize for the lack of content over the last month and a half. Of course, it is summer and staying very busy with lots of travel, and work is, of course, always busy. So, apologize that I haven't had an episode out, but still working on doing some research and reading some books for some background on some future episodes. Today, this is going to be a little bit different than my usual podcast episodes. We are going to be covering some historical figures, and the difference today is that I'm going to be teaming up with my friend Ryan Chastain, who has built quite the following on TikTok and other social media, but also has a pretty successful podcast. One of the best podcasts out there, honestly, about what's going on in the modern horse industry. So today we wanted to kind of cross our paths, if you will, and talk about two legends that recently passed away in the Western industry, and that is Baxter Black and Buster Welch. So, without further ado, I'm going to get into the episode, give you a little introduction on Jay Ryan. I know you've probably heard me talk about him before. He runs the Behind the Horse's Eyes podcast that I mentioned, and he's a fantastic guy. So, looking forward to y'all hearing this conversation, and hopefully, this will be the first of many with Jay Ryan. So, stay tuned. Well, alrighty, I got the message.
Oh, I did too.
Yeah.
So we are live, my guy.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. I mean, it just took long enough for me to get all of my ducks in a row. A few of them were slower than others.
Yeah, well, I do have a bone to pick with you already because I'm coming on after Danger Aaron or Feral Aaron, which I always mix up with Danger Aaron. But I saw her at the American Horse Council, and so I'm like, well, shoot, now I've got to follow her up. I mean, history is completely boring compared to what
You know
she
what?
does on a day-to-day basis.
I hope you wear a size 14 because those are some big boots to fill.
For
She
sure.
she is an absolute doll, and anybody to devote their life just the way she's done. I'm going up there this fall, and that's gonna be a lot of fun. So I look forward to helping her. And quick note for everybody that doesn't know, in my store, my merch store, the Feral Appalachia shirt's still up. 100% of that goes to Aaron, and you guys have raised over $200 so far for her.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Yeah, but I saw that she was on. I was like, man, I am definitely gonna have to bring my A game now.
So why don't you tell tell the folks a little about who you are. We've been conversing a little bit back and forth, and kind of sort of become brothers in history, I guess.
Yeah, so my name's Austin Halverson, and grew up in Oklahoma, showing quarter horses. Parents are both professional horsemen, judges for AQHA. So I was involved, every horse show there every weekend, doing stuff not just with my parents, but also with the association. And so just really grew up in the industry. And although I wasn't always as interested in the showing aspect, I always liked roping and whatnot, but wasn't really the type to want to hop on the trail and compete every weekend. I really liked the history and learning things about Western history and all that. So whenever I moved off to college, kind of left the horses at home, got my degree, and started reading a lot more, trying to stay involved, and decided there's a lot of stories that aren't told. There's a lot of great stories, a lot of great books, but in the podcasting world, over the last 10 years, you can find stories about just about anything except for the Western way of life. And I always joke, it's because we're probably 15 years behind the 8 ball on, anything technologically advanced like podcasts, right? So that's why I decided to get into it.
Yeah, I have this conversation a lot with a lot of people about the industry as a whole, the horse industry as a whole, and that includes the Western industry from ranching to horses, the English industry from things like English sport and polo. The entire industry as a whole is 15 to 20 years behind when it comes to brands marketing, to technology. I mean, you name it, it's nuts. Um,
Yeah. And it's funny because it's fun to watch, as somebody who works in the legal field, has worked in the government and whatnot. Watching people in our industry adapt things that are 10 years behind and just absolutely, knock it out of the park. And you're like, man, maybe we should hop in on this a little earlier
yeah.
and create some success, ride the waves. And of course, one thing that kind of made me decide that this is something that's fruitful is the recent spur from not only COVID. People, rodeos are impossible to get into. It they're crowded, packed, whatnot, because during COVID they were really the only game in town. And I saw those crowds on the Cowboy Channel, and I saw the folks at the horse shows and whatnot. And I thought, you know what, there is an audience for this. The reason that nobody's doing it is not because there's not an audience. And I think you would probably agree with that, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah, the we've seen a huge influx here in the last couple of years, and COVID had a lot to do with it because again, it was the only show. Western sports, the only show in town. Everybody else was on hold. And then television shows like Yellowstone in 1883, and it has really brought light to the industry for better in most cases, and for worse in some cases, because as you and I both know, the what years that we have take to try to get away from misconception and legend. When someone new comes in, those are usually the first things that they grab to, and those are the exciting points and stuff. And yeah, then you end up having conversations about notches on pistols and things like that. But yeah, it's grown leaps and bounds in the last 3 years.
Yeah. And, so what I wanted to do was kind of bring that primer to folks. And that's why I kind of chose podcasts because, I always thought the best place that the place that I want my podcast to end up is I think about all of the folks in the industry who have listened to the same 40 country songs on their
Yes.
radio in their arena since, 1991.
Yep.
Because there's songs that I don't even know the name of that I can sing
Yep.
because of all my days in the barn and at rodeos that, I would like to bring stories not only to those folks, but the new folks, but, just bring some type of entertainment value to that world that's a little different than your radio playing the same songs every day.
I always tell people when it comes to country radio, not to go down a rabbit hole here. Cole Wetzel is actually coming into town here, and this is a prime example. And you can always tell a certain demographic from another when half the people are going, "Who?" and the other half are going, "I've already bought tickets."
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard to explain that there's music that exists outside of the radio. Just like in our industry, it's hard to explain to people that what you see in the radio arena is not everyday life.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a little bit about me. Started the Rancher at the end of 2020, middle of COVID. Been kind of scared. How do you do this? How do you record a podcast? What does that sound like? My first iteration, my first episode was on the history of the American quarter horse, and it was so choppy and so bad that a month later, after I had a few other podcasts under my belt, went back and re-recorded it because I was, like, man, we gotta clean up the audio. So really continuing to learn and get better at that side, but branched off into YouTube videos. And then my wife was like, you've got to be on TikTok. That's where the audiences are. So I hopped on, and that's where I met the Horse King himself, who I'm now talking to.
Here we go.
So, glad that we connected, and, you had the idea to get on TikTok where the audiences were before me. And I really find that, fantastic that you are doing that, because I do think that that's where, with the algorithm, the way it's set up, I mean, you get in front of people that would never have ever thought about, riding horses or anything about them. And all of a sudden they are listening to every single episode or everything you post. Right. So, that's a little bit about my journey to where I am sitting here now.
I'm going to pause just for a second. Pause
Okay.
the recording just for a second. I've got one thing I got to take care of. Take like 2 seconds.
Yeah, no problem.
I feel so unprofessional right now.
Hey, you're good. All right, for folks listening on my channel, wanted to introduce you to the guy I'm talking with today, because you can also catch this on his channel, and I would recommend that you do, because outside of this podcast, he has a lot of great content. The man himself, the Horse King, J. Ryan Chastain.
How you doing, Austin?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. So, just gave my little brief bio for yours. Could you give us a little bit of background on yourself and what convinced you to get into the crazy world of podcasting about the Western industry?
Well, I guess to start from the beginning with me, I'm a first generation horseman. My family were cattlemen, but we're not into horses whatsoever. It was ATVs and pickup trucks. Horses might as well be a hole in the ground you throw money at. They were not fond of the horse game. And then I'd always had an affection for the horse, and when I finally got old enough to buy a horse, that's exactly what I did. Do I regret that decision? Yes, because it's a disease. But outside of that, I've had several other podcasts other than the one that's actually gaining traction right now, which is Behind the Horse's Eyes, and I appreciate everybody that listens. And a bunch failed, like everyone, just never did anything. It's kind of one of those things where you sit around with all your buddies and everything's funny that you're saying, and you go, hey, let's record this, let's be a great podcast, and then you realize that you're only funny to yourselves.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how that happened, but it really kind of sparked something in me. And I'd always been a student of history. That was kind of my study in school. I've worked in the museum system, and I never furthered my studies, but I've always been drawn to the history of everything. It doesn't matter if it's tangible or even not. I'm interested in the history of it. And so it was only kind of bound to happen that the history of the horse would become a major part of my life. And I did that via TikTok. Everybody said, get a TikTok. And that was an accident too. We were out trail riding one day and I saw all my friends holding their cameras up, and I'm like, what are y'all doing? Oh, we're making TikToks. And I'm like, the crap is a TikTok. And so I downloaded the app, and shoot, here we are. I mean, I took a video of a snake while I was on a skid steer, and it got 500,000 views. And I was like, oh, wait, is this fame? And then I made a video poking fun at Hancock horses. It got 500,000 views. So I was like, I wonder what Appaloosas will do. And then a lynch mob showed up at the house. Don't pick on Appaloosas, man. Those ladies are crazy. But no, and it just gained traction. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to go down the role of American Quarter Horse Hall of Famers. I'll do that first. I'll sprinkle in a few racing horses because that interests me as well. And then we will go from there. And then I started doing things like breeds that I was interested in, like the Morgan and the American Saddlebred and, other horses. And it just took, people seemed to like it, and I enjoy it. And I think that's why I still do it. It's because I enjoy it. And then I was lucky enough to meet you, another student of history that's way more eloquent and prepared than I will ever be. We'll just go ahead and throw that out there. I'm flying by the seat of the pants. Austin's over here very well prepared. I'm like, I've got a phone and a handful of notes. Let's make magic happen.
I don't know about that. Every time I record one, I'm like, man, there's got to be a better way to put this story together. It's just, I mean, even though someone's life started somewhere and ended somewhere, you're like, surely there's a better way to put this together.
Have you ever run across a situation where you found somebody completely interesting, like they're famous for something, but then you start really digging into them and you go, there's nothing interesting about them except for this one little piece of thing that they did?
Yes.
Like they lived, did a thing, and died. Like that was it.
Yeah. I mean, I always say like the hardest podcast I ever did was Bully Rock. which, is like supposed to be this like incredibly important, figure in the horse industry and the horse history here in America. And
Mhm.
it's like, well, what did he do? It's like, well, he lived in England and then he was brought to America. It's like, okay, what else? Like, no, that's what he did.
Yeah.
Like that's
Well,
it.
I tell people about Leo. Everybody assumes Leo had this great life, and we don't know much about Leo's racing career because it was all like fairgrounds and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And he was in a trailering accident and was completely lame. Outside of that and making babies, that's all Leo ever did.
Yeah.
So, and everybody's like, do Leo. And I'm like, Leo's not that interesting.
Yeah, I know. It's hard. It's it's that thing of kill your heroes, right? It's like, man, once you
Yeah.
start looking into some of these, it's not as
No, and
glamorous.
they always, a good friend of mine, and she listens to, her name's Phoenix Jumps, and awesome eventer and dressage rider here in Aiken. She always says, don't Google your heroes. Because I think Frances Marion broke her heart. I was
Oh
like, no,
yeah.
don't Google anyone that died before 1860.
No,
Just
yeah.
don't.
Shoot, even afterwards. I
Yes.
mean, it's like yeah, no, I mean, I feel like that's the biggest part of history. And I always tell people, I say, look, I mean, one thing that you learn from history is that you have to have compassion for these figures because I mean, I've shoot it's Sunday. I've, you know, gone to church and sinned since then. Like that's just the way humans are. Like it, if you're gonna judge someone, you got to judge both the good and the bad. And sometimes the fact that there's bad is what makes it even more impressive that they were able to do what they did. And
Yeah,
that's what history, it has taught me so much more about forgiveness and perspective
that's
in
right.
other people.
Well, and it is very easy to look at history in the context of the modern lens. And that's a hard way to look at history. You can't put historical figures in the modern context because you'll hate them all.
Hmm.
Because a lot of people truly are people of their time. And if that time was horrible, then so be it. You know what I'm saying? Um, Napoleon, in some eyes, is considered a hero for what he brought to the areas that he conquered. Well, if you lived in that area and he killed your dad in battle, he was not a hero.
Yeah.
You see what I'm
Yeah.
saying? And
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's, I mean, victors write the history. So
100%.
if PETA happens to win, uh our great grandchildren might look at us with quite a different lens than how we view ourselves.
I rolled
So
my eyes so hard I got a headache now, Austin.
I'm just saying that's why you've got to win, right?
I've got
So
it.
that's why we're trying to educate people here so that in a few hundred years, the Western way of life is not completely gone and extinguished. So I
Yeah.
think it's something worth preserving and worth telling stories about.
Well, it's 100% is because it is America's history is brief compared to the rest of the world. And Western expansion is even briefer as far as the height of the Old West.
Mm-hmm.
And so much happened in such a short period of time, but also something else happened too. And that's the dime novel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it it misconstrued a lot. And I'm glad that there's a guy like you out there that just gives the straight dope. Because a lot of the people, and I think I said earlier, a lot of the people that we hold in such high regard and high esteem, if you met them on the street, you probably wouldn't have liked them.
Yeah.
Somebody like Wyatt Earp may have been a huge jerk.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, one of my heroes, Charles Goodnight, by
Yeah.
all accords, was such a Bible thumper. Like, would have been the worst person to hang out with
Yeah.
because he was so strict and so, just like by the book. Like, you probably would have been like, man, we got to get out of here. This guy's gonna, start lashing us about across the back for
Yeah.
wanting to have a beer with him.
Or like, everybody wants to talk about the first Pony Express riders, and they were really just young kids that made more money than they had sense and drank it all away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, you would not want to know unless you're just in the party crowd. You wouldn't want to know them. They were the frat boys of their day.
For sure. Yeah. No, history is a fascinating place. As you said, American history is brief. And, not to bring in Yellowstone for those of y'all who don't want to talk about Yellowstone,
Oh, we're going to
but,
talk about Yellowstone.
the year 1883, I mean, it seems like 90% of my podcasts, the person I'm talking about was prominent in the year 1883. I mean, that's just such a, critical time period. I mean, the expansion, like you were talking about, the cattle trails, I mean, so much was happening in the early 1880s. I mean, I would say that, every famous story we have because of dime novels coming out in the 1890s comes from 75 through 85.
Yeah.
It's a 10-year period. I
But,
mean,
and then a lot of people, I think they miss the idea too that our idea of the Old West is between like 1883 and 1885.
mhm,
And they forget that the 1870s, all the way to like 1910,
yeah.
could be just as wild. There were still people robbing trains and stagecoaches, and there were still mud and blood on the streets of some of these towns. And it
Mhm.
was chaos in a lot of these places, but there was law. It's not gun smoke all the time.
Yeah.
The good guy doesn't get always just shot in the shoulder. Matt Dillon, that shoulder has to be worn out.
For sure. Yeah. Well, it's funny because, kind of a nice segue into what we're going to talk about. The lives of two men, one of them, Buster Welch, the other, Baxter Black. I mean, Buster Welch, when you go back through his life, I mean, he passed away a month ago, and he was of the age where skipping school to go ride broncs was still acceptable. I mean, there
Yeah.
was no truant officer coming after him for it.
No. And then, yeah, because there were no truant officers.
Yeah.
And the crazy thing is, and I know we'll get into it, is that only did he live in that time, he lived in a modern time with cell phones and smartphones and was still competing at a high level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. He was still hopping on horses well into his 80s and wooing crowds. So it's a fascinating link when you talk about men like that and how, 1883 was not as far away as you think it was.
No,
It's 3, 4 generations. And sometimes men can live to where it's only 2 generations.
exactly.
So, yeah. Well, with that said, you want to get into the life of Buster Welch?
Let's jump into the life of Buster Welch.
All right. Well, I think the big prelude to his life for me, is I want you to think about the adversity that I'm going to talk about and how Buster Welch turned that adversity into success. Because, especially today, they say, oh, this generation sucked, or, every generation says that the ones after them aren't as tough. But when you think about what we might be facing here in the future, if you lived through 2008 financial crash, or you think that one's about to happen again, sometimes it's good to look at the lives of men like Buster Welch, who, born in 1928. Think about all of the economic uncertainty, especially in the horse industry of all industries, that he had to deal with, and how he somehow came out of each one of those crises a better man. He turned those things into a success in his life. But, to start off, born May 23rd, 1928, just outside of Sterling City, Texas. I always like to throw in a little geography for my people, Jay Ryan. Do you know where Sterling City is?
I haven't a clue. Texas might as
So
well be another country for me. I know where Stephenville is, and I know where El Paso and Waco are.
okay, so if you want to cut halfway between Stephenville and El Paso, which is a good healthy like 700, 800 miles, right in the middle of there somewhere, just a little south, is Sterling City. So if you're heading out towards Midland,
I know
it's,
where Midland is. Yes.
yeah, there's these great towns, Eden, Garden City, Sterling City. They make you think that they're these beautiful, oases, but instead they're dusty towns where there's not even any fence. I mean, they literally just have row crops of cotton and, sheep and goats. I mean, there's just nothing out there. And so that's kind of where Buster Welch was born into this, 1928 Dust Bowl era Texas. I mean, just think about town of 300-400, and not many hopes and dreams coming out of there, if you know what I
No,
mean.
no.
And even worse than that, his mother died shortly after his birth, and his dad left him with his grandparents to go get a job to provide for his now burgeoning family in Midland for the oil fields, which were just coming about. So he was being raised by his grandparents, and they had a little bit of a stock operation, and so he was raised around livestock, but kind of the old school system of subsistence, just getting by type of farming. This was not any major operation where they were making any money by any means, but
It sounds like
he
my
did.
it
What?
sounds like my teenage years is what you just described.
Oh man, well, luckily not as dusty in Aiken, South Carolina, right?
No, no. We were in Northeast Alabama at the time with a herd
Oh.
of seed Angus,
Mm-hmm.
and Angus weren't quite as lucrative as then as they are now. And it was a great idea. We ate a lot of eggs, and that was only because the hens laid them.
Yeah. I always, my grandfather grew up in, Depression era North Dakota, and he was born in, I believe, late 19 teens, early 1920s. And he said one year we traded our milk cow for chickens during the Depression. He said we ate a lot of chicken that year.
Yeah.
It's like there was no other choice. Chicken
Yeah,
on the menu.
yeah. Cows ate before we did a lot of times.
Yeah, yeah. So fortunately, though, his dad, was getting pretty successful out in Midland, and so he remarried and brought Buster to Midland. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, he was a little bit more interested in the trade going on at the stock sales and the auction house than he was at the school. So he would go instead and learn from the folks that were hanging out at the stockyards, the cow punchers, the ranchers, all of them. And that's where he started breaking horses and meeting kind of the local stockmen, if you will. So at 13, he ran away. And again, I mean, 13 years old, I would say that most 13-year-olds are what, seventh, eighth grade. Like
Yeah,
that's not much schooling. So ran away and joined the Proctor brothers, who had a ranch out there. And there's not much information on the Proctor brothers. I was trying to hunt down. I know that they're very prominent in Midland, and there's awards and scholarships and stuff named after them, but there's just not really a good history of them. Hence why I try and do these podcasts, because I'm sure they've got a grandkid or someone in the family that would love to kind of share that story. But a very sizable ranch that Welch went to work for and was kind of funded by oil money. And he was breaking colts and chopping wood and carrying water. I mean, he was doing the grunt work that, of course, you would put any 13-year-old on at that time, because, of course, they're not going to get to do the fancy day work of just riding and, being a cowboy, if you will. So he had a pretty tough start there. But from the Proctors, he went to a lot of famous ranches. And here in Texas, we have what's called the Texas barbecue passport. Have you ever heard of this,
I have
Jeremiah?
heard. Yep.
Yeah, so a lot of folks in Texas like to go from through the Texas Monthly Top 50 list and get stamps on their passport, and I mean, spend weekends taking day trips to no-name towns in the middle of nowhere off highways to get barbecue. And I kind of joked that Buster Welch did the Texas Ranch Passport Club, because he worked on basically the who's who of Texas ranches, right? He worked for the Proctors. He worked on the 4.6s, the Matador, the Long X, the King Ranch, the Pitchfork. I mean, you name it. It seems like he worked on it between the time he turned about 16, 17 and the end of his life. And of course, he's most noted for his work on the King Ranch and the 4.6s, of course, with Yellowstone. But I don't know how many cowboys you've talked to, but it seems like all of them tend to jump around for one reason or another. Typically, it's because they're not the most agreeable of guys. Uh,
Yeah, most and these days it's you see a lot of gals, a lot of
mhm.
cowgirls that are out there living out of trailers. In fact, I just sat down with Amanda Ray, and that's what she's doing. She moved from Alberta, Canada, to the States, and she is going from state to state, starting colts, doing 30-day starts on colts, and that's the lifestyle she chose. I'm living vicariously through them because I love having roots.
Yeah,
Um, but I can only imagine the lifestyle. For a young man, it's got to be awesome.
I know. It's it's kind of like my generation after college, right? You go to Europe to backpack and find yourself, right? It's like, man, I would much rather just find myself a nice saddle and find myself
Yeah,
here in the United States for a lot cheaper and maybe even get paid to do it. But
that's right. Buy a saddle and a bedroll and just travel.
yeah. So completely different lifestyle though than a lot of the horse trainers that we think of. There's a different tough road to hoe for horse trainers that typically involves just living in the back of a horse trailer at every different horse show every weekend. But with his experience and success working on these ranches, he actually saved up a little bit of money and decided to get into the cattle business himself, which um, you know, I've never been in the cattle business. My advice to anyone, and my advice that I've ever gotten from anyone, is don't get into the cattle business.
Yeah, that is the best advice I can. Even if you start out, hey, I'm going to start out a small seed stock operation. Don't.
Yeah. So unfortunately, he bought in and thought, hey, I'm going to go into business for myself. But immediately a drought struck Texas pretty hard in the 1950s. So if you remember back, born in 1928, and he's getting his herd started just around the 1950s. So he's really still in his mid 20s. I mean, just getting started, uh, just buying enough money to scrape by to get a piece of land and get some cattle, and this drought strikes. And as I mentioned earlier, pay attention to what he did. He decided to turn his attention towards cutting, and so this is where he started, getting on some good horses and practicing. And he's seen the National Cutting Horse Association, had started in the late 1940s. It's interesting, the American Quarter Horse Association, the NCHA, all of these associations really came out of that post-war period. And just like America, men came back from war, and idle hands are the devil's playground, right? I feel like all their wives were like, go form some association and get out of the house. So, he found himself in the burgeoning sport of cutting, and there were just now becoming fraternities, championship shows, and the popularity of cutting. The old west. I mean, you had heroes on the TV that were in these spaghetti westerns, if you will. And he decided, with this popularity, maybe I can make some money doing this to supplement what's going on in the cattle business. And he, got a few horses that he had become familiar with when he worked for Homer Ingham and Warren Shoemake, which were respected cattlemen out in New Mexico and West Texas. And, one of the first ones that he had was Chickasha Mike that, got him his start. And his sire was, of course, the legendary Billy Clegg. You know much about that horse, Jay Ryan?
Um, you're gonna be mad, but I don't have that horse in my notes.
That's fine. Billy Clegg, there's not a ton known about him, I will say, but he has a lot of famous offspring, which I will try and put some links in the show notes about him. But, as we were mentioning earlier about Leo and some of these other horses, not a ton known about him, had a bit of a show career, but, amongst his offspring were Chickasha Mike. But, Chickasha Mike will come back into the story. It was Marion's Girl who brought him his first NCHA World Championship. which was in 1954, and then also his second one in 1956. So wanted to talk a little bit about Marion's Girl. Of course, had Wimpy via her sire, Silver Wimpy. I have a whole episode on Wimpy. I love Wimpy. Have you heard my theory on where he got his nickname?
No, I haven't heard your theory. I did a video on Wimpy, and I didn't necessarily have a theory on the name, but I want to hear your theory.
So I honestly think, Popeye, Wimpy from Popeye. So Popeye actually originated from a cartoonist in South Texas.
Oh, really?
And so for some reason, I feel like, there's some type of popularity of Popeye at that time. It all kind of lines up of like when those cartoons were out, South Texas, all of that. I think he might have been named after, a cartoon character, which, is not out of the realm of possibility. I've heard other people say, well, it's kind of like when you call the biggest guy in the classroom, Pipsqueak or Tiny.
Yeah.
So maybe that's where it came from, but I like to think that maybe it has something to do with.
I just think it's funny that Mr. P1, the first horse ever registered with the American Quarter Horse Association, is Wimpy.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure when they actually chose that, they were like, are we sure that this is the one that we want to, don't we want to give it to a horse with a name like Strong Mike or,
we've got Strong Mike, El Diablo, and Wimpy.
Yeah. It's, but, poetic justice, I guess. So, interestingly enough, Marion's Girl was actually an orphan, and was going to have what I consider another not so great name, Wimpy's Dooney. So that was the original name that she was registered under.
This goes full circle back to our previous conversation about some of these names.
Yeah, I mean, I have no information on where Dooney was coming from, but
and that's something too, and not to cut you off, that a lot of people have to understand about some of these earlier horses is that though they may have competed a couple of times, they went straight from competition to a ranch and punching out babies. And so there's not a lot on them. We know more about their offspring than we do them sometimes. And even horses that are in the Hall of Fame, some of those horses, all we have is their pedigree and their offspring.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's going to be the story on Marion's Girl, because I'll say Marion's Girl got the name because an oilman named Marion Flint bought her. And so it was, when you go back onto some of these pedigrees, I mean, you've read enough of them, it'll be like, Joe's, filly.
Yep.
Like, it's Mr. Smith's, stallion, like that. After a certain point, that's all they were known as, right?
Well, it was very common around the turn of the century, up into the 20s, to name a horse after its owner, especially if it was a founding sire of a line. Joe Hancock. Joe Hancock got the name because it was owned by Joe Hancock when they went to the racing secretary to register the horse. The horse didn't really have a name, had a barn name. They were like, what do you want to call the horse? It's owned by a guy named Hancock.
Yeah. Or, if you got really lucky, they would at least say the color. So like, John's Roan. It's like, oh, at least we can differentiate it between that and his bay,
So like the third horse registered with the AQHA, and another horse that it's on everything's paperwork, including fence posts and John Deere tractors, is Joe Reed. Named after Joe Reed.
Yeah, which I guess is almost kind of a vanity play these days, to look back, feel like name the horse after yourself, it'll get in the record books.
Yeah. So if you ever see anything, 20 years from now, that's in the AQHA Hall of Fame and it's named Ryan Chastain, it had to be a fan because I didn't breathe that.
Yeah, no, I gotcha. That's like the halter horse, Beyonce. So definitely wasn't her horse, but
I'm gonna have to go research this horse now.
You will. Yeah, that was a pretty prominent mare when I was growing up, showing halter horses. So pretty successful one. I don't know if she's had any good offspring, but
I mean, a halter horse and then named Beyonce, and then I'm thinking about it makes sense.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So back to Marion's Girl though, she was purchased by Marion Flint for $2,500, and he told Welch, hey, I want you to work your magic. He was very well known in West Texas. Welch was, for getting these horses into prime shape, and so over her career, they earned $35,000, which
At
is
the
a pretty
time.
yeah, pretty good chunk of change, especially you think that's almost 10 or more than 10 times what they paid for. Obviously we always talk about the hidden costs of horse ownership, but I think $35,000 would have covered it back then.
And for those that are wondering what the hidden cost is, it's everything.
It's not very hidden.
Yeah, it's not hidden. It's everything: mind, body, soul, and bank account.
Yeah. Uh, but as I mentioned earlier, the sad part about Marion's Girl is that in the late 50s, she was bred to king, and neither her nor the foal would survive to term. So, that was the end of that. I mean, you have no offspring from one of the most famous cutting horses of the early NCHA era right there. And, as you mentioned, that's the sad part about some of these horses back then, is that you don't have much of a story of them living besides their offspring. And if they don't have any, then, they really become lost in the annals of history, because they don't even have a track record to show for it.
And especially being bred to king, which
mm-hmm.
was definitely going to be the foundation of the line.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was, they were putting it all out on the line on the first one. That was going to be.
They were throwing it all at the wall.
Yeah. So tough break for Marion's Girl, but of course Buster Welch, moved on and became one of the first 10 men who pitched in to underwrite the first NCHA futurity, which he also then won in 1962 with a horse named Money's Glow, which I think is a fantastic name. Yes. That fits kind of more into the names of horses of the last 20 years than it does a horse in 1962. They were ahead of their time with that one, I think.
It definitely fits in today.
Yeah.
You could hear Money's Glow right up there with Metallic Cat, and it would just slide right in.
Yeah, you would think, okay, it's a little tacky, but it fits.
Listen, I had an American saddlebred named My Honey's Money.
So, oh yeah,
it was tacky. We called him Benjamin, like $100 bills.
That's, man, I always love that. Finding the good barn name based on their names.
Well, his original barn name was Bobby, but I had a renter on the property that was named Bobby at the time, so I couldn't yell Bobby because they'd both turn and look at me. So it was like, "You're Ben now."
That's funny. So then in 63 he came back and won it with a Chickasha Glow, which actually had was kind of the first horse that he had bred between his previous ones that came together to get him another successful horse. Chickasha Mike bred along with Money's Glow, and then in 66 with Ray J's Pete, which, I mean, now we're getting into some of the names that Welch is more famous for, because in 71 it was Dry Dock that he won the futurity on, and in 77 it was Peppy San Badger. So I think we probably need to pause there for a minute and point out those two horses and why they should not just be listed as futurity winners.
Yeah. So when you talk about horses, like, first of all, we got to start with Dry Dock, because Dry Dock is the result of Dot Bar and Pacolina. Okay, and if Pacolina doesn't ring a bell, then all of those Paco horses, Paco Bueno, all of those sorts, yeah, that's Pacolina.
Mm-hmm.
Dot Bar is probably the epitome of the American quarter horse in his time.
Yep.
There's been a lot of people that want to say the mixer horse is Dot Bar, or it's Wimpy, or it's this, that, and the other. Let's just say those horses were quintessential of what the AQHA was looking for. And in fact, Dot Bar completely changed the rules when it came to how they judged halter stock.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah, and I had the privilege of growing up not too far from Orrin Mixer's property, and would drive by, and it was always funny to look out and be like, oh, that's the landscape that he drew those
Yeah.
things on. But as you mentioned, I mean, all of these horses did have a part to play in building that composite of the American quarter horse.
And on a side note on Orrin Mixer, just real briefly. So I've had, I don't know, 100 people say, "Oh, by the way, the Mixer horse is wimpy." And then there's another handful that goes, "No, it's my uncle's horse," or "No,
Yeah.
it's Dot Bar." I just want to let everybody know that the Mixer horse is purely just the Mixer horse, but
Yeah.
there is an image, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Orrin Mixer actually painted it of Wimpy,
Hmm.
but it's reversed and it's a different background. But the horses do look very similar. But I promise you guys, the Mixer horse was a figment of Mixer's imagination. And for those that don't know what the Mixer horse is, that is the image that the AQHA uses for the American quarter horse. They gave it out everything. It's been on every calendar. It's been on T-shirts. It was hanging in every feed store for probably 40 years. It's a sorrel quarter horse with a field and a few trees in the background.
Hmm.
You can't miss it. If I'm not mistaken, I think the Mixer horse is what, one white sock or something
One
like
white
that.
sock and a short tail.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's nothing but Orrin Mixer's idea of the quintessential American quarter horse.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not wrong to say, oh, that Wimpy or Doc Bar or Poco Bueno. I mean, it's not wrong to say any of those horses are the Mixer horse, but just not all of it.
No.
My dad was quintessential in creating the World Conformation Horse Association, WCHA, and they did the exact thing that Orrin Mixer did. They came up with the quintessential halter horse, and I mean, he can tell you, yeah, we said that it needs to have hocks that look like this and stifles that look like that, but like it's not one horse, because
No.
there is no perfect horse, right?
Mm-mm.
There probably never will be, but some of these horses get close, and dry dock and all of them are definitely part of that line, that early 70s line that kind of set a broader foundation. When we talk about foundation horses, we always want to talk about Wimpy because he won, and King and Leo and all these horses. But I mean, there's the Peppies and the Dry Docks and all these are really that second generation that
Yes.
culminated in the the breed discipline specific horses, the cutting horse
Yep.
versus the reining horse versus instead of just the quarter horse.
And most of the early horses were what I call the pure essence of what the AQHA was, and that was quarter mile race horses.
Mm-hmm.
Heavy thoroughbred influence. Why there's other associations other than the American Quarter Horse Association, such as the Foundation Quarter Horse Association, National Foundation. Those are completely different horses. And those early horses, the Leos, the Joe Reeds and those type of horses, they bear very little resemblance to those second generation horses, the Dry Docks and the Dot Bars and the Mr. Sandpeppies.
Mm-hmm.
They were bigger, stronger, and more suited to certain sport. This be it either cutting or reining cow horse, or so be it.
Yeah, for sure. And Peppy Sam Badger, King Ranch. I mean, this is it's fascinating to see. Kind of, we're seeing a renaissance, right, of the 4.6s and the King Ranch. If you look at their advertisements in the Quarter Horse Journal and other places, they're coming back. But there was a period in the 90s, early 2000s where they weren't breeding competitive horses in the quarter horse world the way some more trainer oriented or breeding oriented places were. I mean, it was just like they were making money selling Ford trucks with King Ranch edition on them instead.
Yeah.
So it's cool to see them come back to that. But the 70s was really the heyday of the quarter horse breeding on some of these places. And we're seeing them work their way back towards that now. But Welch was a big part of that because, again, of course, he was at the King Ranch in the 4.6s, and he trained cutting horses and held clinics and schools to train other folks on how to become effective champion cutters in the showing world. And at the same time, he was also trying to manage a few different ranches at the same time, like not at the same time as this, like 2 or 3 ranches he was trying to manage while also doing all of this, just like, I don't know how he had the time to hop on a horse, much less do any of this, because I mean, managing a ranch is obviously a 24/7 job, much less 2 or 3 of them. But in 1971, as I mentioned, Dry Dock was the 4th to win the NCHA fraternity with Welch. And, he was a full brother to Doc Olina and was by Doc Bar out of Pocolina and was bred by Dr. and Mrs. Stephen Jensen. So, just wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to Dr. Jensen, definitely a respected breeder in the quarter horse world. But back to Welch, I think that his legendary status was sealed in '74 when he rode Mr. San Pepe for the King Ranch to an NCHA World Championship. It's funny because one of Welch's sons was also riding at the same time, and so we have this fantastic time period where one of them's riding Mr. San Pepe and the other one's riding San Pepe Badger. I mean, can you imagine you show up to a competition and you're like, all right, who's here? And they say, oh, well, the Welches and the Pepes are here. And you're just like,
I just put my stick back on the trailer.
Yeah.
I'm added money.
Myself the check and I'm going to get out of here.
Yeah. You're just added money, kid. That's all it is.
Yeah. So, won the championship in '74 and then in '76. And then actually in '76 also won the AQHA World Championship in cutting. So, really, I mean, how else to say it but dominant at this point in time. And, Pepe San Badger was bred by Joe Kirk Fulton, which for those of us who are from the Big 12 states, Joe Kirk Fulton was one of the first masked riders for Texas Tech. So if you ever look out on game day and see the masked rider riding out after a touchdown, Joe Kirk Fulton helped start that.
So he started the whole Red Raider on horseback. I did not know that. I learned a thing.
Yeah. So I actually went to the Stonewall Rodeo, which is in Stonewall, Texas, a few weeks ago, and the Fulton Ranch is one of the big sponsors. He unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but the Fulton Ranch is quite possibly one of the most beautiful parts of Texas, right outside of Fredericksburg, which is now all, bachelorette wine country. So who knows how long a ranch will be able to hold on out there.
Somebody will want to put condos in a dog park.
Yeah. So, moving on through his career, I could talk for days about the championships and, Pepe San Badger getting in the Quarter Horse Hall of Fame and, 21 million from his offspring. But, you're going to have to read that because this would get a little boring if we just listed off numbers. To sound a little bit
we could talk 3 hours about each of those horses.
Yeah, it'll start to sound a little bit more like an Old Testament book if I start reading, numbers and names.
In the beginning, there was Mr. San Pepe.
Yes.
Actually, no, it would be in the beginning, there was Leo, because that's where it started.
Yeah, there you go. But, one of the interesting things I found from a obituary for Mr. Welch was I'm going to read from it directly. It said that Welch's contributions to the cutting horse, ranching, and Western way of life were recognized far and wide. He was a member of the NCHA Members Hall of Fame and the NCHA Riders Hall of Fame. He is also in the American Quarter Horse Association Hall of Fame and the Texas Cowboy Hall of Fame, and has been honored with several awards, including a statue in Fort Worth. And some of the accolades include the National Golden Spur, the Foy Proctor Memorial Cowman's Award, the Zane Schulte Award, the Charles Goodnight Award, the Western Horseman Award, and the Trailblazers Award. So, I mean, he, if there's an award for a cowboy alive today, Buster Welch won it. And I think that that's why that scene in Yellowstone is pretty accurate. Uh, you know, that there's three people that we really respect and revere here in Texas, and Mr. Welch was definitely one of them.
You call them what? The three gods of Texas, the
Yeah,
almighty George Strait and Buster Welch.
yeah, that was the line. But unfortunately, he passed away June 12th in Abilene, Texas, at the age of 94. Quite the life lived. You think about 1928 to today, what all someone would have seen. I mean, especially in our horse industry, just a fascinating life and a fascinating character to talk about.
And one of the things that fascinates me about him is that a lot of people don't know in 1999 Buster had a stroke, and then in 2011 recovers from a stroke, and then in Fort Worth wins the National Cutting Horse Association Fraternity Championship Cup on Bet He's a Cat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean,
I get out of the bed with like a little sciatic nerve pain, and I'm not getting on a horse that day. This man has a stroke, and
20 years later.
yeah, and then, jeez, Louise, they don't make them like that anymore.
No, and I mean, they have an interview with blanking on his name. Bet He's a Cat's trainer, and he said, I mean, I grew up idolizing this guy, and he hops on my horse and puts on a performance like that. Like hard to imagine. There, I know for a fact there wasn't a dry eye in the house because I know people that were there.
And he was in his 70s at that time?
Yeah,
recovered from a stroke in his 70s on let's just say a very highly bred quarter horse.
Yeah,
that's going on to give us some amazing babies. Anything with the last name Cat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, obviously it's not as fast paced as NASCAR or whatnot, but imagine if a 70-year-old, like a Richard Petty, were to hop in a NASCAR, stock car today and win the Daytona 500. I mean, it's unfathomable that someone can do that.
Well, and the fact they do it at a high level.
Yeah,
it's one thing to go out there and do I don't know, one of those tribute kind of things. They put a little, they put a steer in front of him that's a little slow, and he just goes through the motions. No. This man won the fraternity.
Scored over like a 221. Like
in his 70s after a stroke.
Yeah. Yeah. So, fascinating life there. If you want to learn more about him, NCHA and AQHA have Hall of Fame pages on him. There's plenty of interviews. I got a lot of information actually from I believe it was a mid 1980s Texas Monthly piece on him. So, think about that. That was 40 years ago. Half of his story hadn't even been told at that time.
No.
So there's great records and great information about him. But, just a foundation of our industry that, unfortunately passed away. I mean, he was there for the beginning of the NCHA.
Well, he was there also for the beginning of what would become the American quarter horse, because you got to think up until the 1950s, a lot of people that own quarter horses could look at somebody else's quarter horse and not know it was a quarter horse.
Yeah.
That was a big thing. Was, well, we don't technically know what a quarter horse is, but we know it's not that. I'm quoting Joe Hancock there, but it was such a pivotal time period, and Buster was there for all of it, and he saw it all come to fruition at the end with some of the amazing well-bred horses we have today that some people don't agree with, but they're saying they're sound. Leave them alone.
Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. Well, I think, another person that we wanted to give, homage to, who passed away, that was big in the industry. Not as much detail about him because I don't think that we should spend any time reading the poetry of Baxter Black, because there's
No.
only one person who can do it properly, and
And
he's
that is Baxter
unfortunately no
Black.
longer with us. Is Baxter Black. So I'm going to tell you at the beginning of this, you're either going to have to, first of all, I would recommend go back and watch a few of them if you never have. And from there, start reading them, and you'll read them in his voice, and that's the only way that Baxter Black should be enjoyed, is in his voice, because he was one of a kind.
We were talking earlier via text, and we were talking about how we both had an admiration for Dan Carlin and the way he uses his voice to frame a story. Baxter Black did the same thing in his poetry. You were there. When Baxter's mouth started moving, you were there.
Yeah. And that was definitely a moving part. In preparation for this, I went back and read a few, and I had some of my own favorites, but one of the ones that I found in the list that I hadn't seen before was one about a state fair or a county fair where everything had gone wrong. And it's the lights went out, the concessions weren't on time, the band quit, a flood came through, all this stuff. But at the very end, a little boy came in and picked up his ribbon. And all these volunteers that are sitting in there dejected get to see this one little boy pick up his 5th place ribbon. And they all say, well, when do we start on next year? And I think anybody that's ever worked in our industry or volunteered on anything understands that feeling of putting on 4-H horse shows or any of that stuff. Man, when it's going on, you're like, I am so sick of this. What did I get myself into? This is more work than I signed up for. And then you see something like a kid who won his first 5th place ribbon, or just got to get out of their house for the day to go show, and it makes it all worth it. And I think that like you said, it just transported me back to a lot of my childhood, and that's what Baxter Black was so good at.
The best compliment I've ever gotten was in a comment, and it was on a video. And I'm so critical because I hate to hear myself talk.
Same.
Like I listen to my shows and my TikToks to edit them, and then outside of that, I don't go back and listen to them. I don't like the way I sound. I know when I paused, when I had to think about something, real quick to get it out. And I had someone comment on a video that said that you are the modern Baxter Black or something like that.
That's high praise.
I threw my phone because I was like, no. I will never, ever, ever fit in those boots. Like, I appreciate the compliment. And I should have made a video about the comment. Comment's still floating around. I forget what. It was on one of the horse history videos. And somebody had said that. And I'm like, ooh. And then everybody started tagging RFD TV. I guess they're trying to give me a job.
Sounds like it.
But I was it just took me so off guard. I'm like, first of all, no, I'm nowhere near what that man was. I appreciate the sentiment and I know what you're trying to say, but you got to say that different.
Yeah, but you've got to remember, I bet Baxter Black would have been very hesitant to take on the mantle of a McMurtry or like anybody from a previous generation. The medium changes, and so I think we just need to honor these men by trying to carry on what they started. And Black was born in 1945, so think about like epitome of a boomer, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny because this generation has become somewhat vilified, but he's the epitome of a boomer, because not only was he born in that time, but he worked his way through his childhood, got his dream job as a veterinarian, and then was like, you know what, I want to do something else. Like fantastic story. But
he was Matt Carricker before there was Matt Carricker.
Yeah, exactly. He said veterinary school is cool, but shooting guns and writing poetry is more fun.
Yeah. I want to be Matt Carricker when I grow up. For
I know.
anybody that doesn't know, it's Demolition Ranch. He's a veterinarian, still
Yep.
licensed veterinarian. His dad was a veterinarian, and now he just gets to play with really cool guns on YouTube.
Yeah. And, I went to A&M, and it's so funny because
You're an Aggie.
I'm an Aggie.
I'm a
And,
Bulldog, so
yeah, well, we'll have to talk about that another time.
it's okay. Just
Luckily, we haven't had to play each other yet.
but Mr. National Champion is fine. We can skip the formalities.
Yeah. Well,
I did watch Jimbo give the I had him on another TV doing his he was watching the game, giving the whole coach's perspective. That was entertaining. I think
I bet.
Jimbo's entertaining.
He
He's good for football.
He is very good for football. He's good for A&M. I think we finally have a coach that we're not just like mad at all the time. I always say the two hardest jobs in football are the OU coach and the A&M coach, because Bob Stoops goes out, wins a national championship, and every year from then on, all they did was talk about how he needs to get fired.
Yeah,
it's like,
listen,
he just won us a ring, and it's like
there are people in Athens right now screaming for Kirby Smart's head.
Yeah.
The man in like 5 years won a national championship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there people are like, yeah, he can't manage quarterbacks. He took a walk-on fifth-string kid and won a national championship. Leave the man alone. So he's got a plan.
Yeah. Well, welcome to college football. But back to Baxter Black. We'll get into quickly his story. So, born in 1945, and he was born as far away from where you would guess the king of Western comedy would be born, and that's Brooklyn, New York. But we're not going to hold that against him, because he was actually born at the Naval Hospital there. So I could not 100% confirm it. But, the only people that are born at the Brooklyn Naval Hospital are folks whose dads are working at the shipyard or are in the Navy. And the fact that, they quickly moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, probably proves that his dad was probably, a New Mexican who fought in World War II and found himself in, post-war Brooklyn, New York. Not Baxter Black is not a Brooklyn guy. Doesn't have the accent.
Could you imagine Baxter Black doing his poetry with like a deep Brooklyn accent, though?
Even better, he might have been the first original, Biggie.
Oh. Somebody out there that does all those sound mixings with voices. Got to do Baxter Black's voice over like Biggie Smalls lyrics.
Yeah, there we go.
Somebody needs to make that happen.
Yeah, that would. He's still rolling over in his grave probably if he heard that after what I've learned about Baxter Black. He was pretty welcoming though, so maybe he would have liked it. He said, "You're the only one who can know if you're a cowboy or not." So maybe he thinks Biggie might be a cowboy too. So, Baxter actually moved back to Las Cruces, New Mexico, and was typical American boy, played high school sports, and a little less typical, rode bulls all the way through college. But interestingly enough, he was the national FFA president when he was a senior going into his freshman year of college. So, kind of a first glimpse of, his future life. I don't know a single FFA officer who's not a fantastic, talented, public speaker. So, pretty interesting little detail that I don't know if he really bragged about or was, known about him by a lot of people.
I didn't know it.
Yeah.
I had no clue.
I don't think it was something that he was, parading about. But when I asked my friend who's big into FFA, he was like, "Oh yeah, he's one of the people we kind of tout as one of our, former members." But thought that was pretty interesting. So rode bulls to pay for his time at New Mexico State University. So he's an Aggie of a different kind. And then went to vet school at Colorado State. And, I always say Colorado State vet school. Obviously you've got Cornell as well, but it's kind of the Harvard of vet schools, and that's coming from an Aggie. I'll say that A&M is the Yale of vet schools.
UC Davis will fight you.
But UC Davis is so much more than a vet school. They are, I will say that UC Davis, is the UC Davis of vet schools, because they are, far and away like one of the best. But I guess I should have put the caveat in. I'm talking
I
about
just wanted to
large
put
animal.
you. I just wanted to put you on the spot.
I appreciate that because you're right. But large animal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Colorado State, A&M. I mean, it's just hard to beat those.
You're
Cornell and UC Davis are just
Kentucky and Georgia.
no. I'm not even going to argue. Those are in a different tier. They're
No,
below.
oh,
They're below
no,
Colorado State.
no,
So
no. I'm about to take my shirt off and wrestle.
I'm looking forward to the comments, but I will put Colorado State and A&M above them any day.
These daggum Aggies, man.
I know, but you know, I say all that to say he went to a fantastic veterinary school, which means that he must have been a good vet. You know, it's not like he was a flunky. You know, I don't know anyone who had him treat their horses, but if you go to Colorado State, you're not going to be a shoddy vet.
No,
Um,
and the fact for one had the grades to make it to vet school, then
mhm.
graduate vet school. You're not a fool.
No, no. So he graduated in '69 and worked at a few different outfits across the Southwest. And, you know, it says that he was a veterinary technician, which, you know, today a vet tech is kind of a different thing than it was back then. I think, you know, he was a full-on veterinarian. I mean, he had the doctorate degree. So more of, you know, a veterinary assistant, you know, kind of an associate, if you will. But, you know, he moved to Benson, Arizona, which is a town that's southeast of Tucson. So not too far from New Mexico and Texas. And, you know, he was working for nearly 20 years in the vet uh, career path, but he'd kind of started easing his way back into public speaking. And so, you know, he'd been writing poetry and speaking at small events and whatnot. You know, I always kind of equate it to going to open mics, right? He was getting booked at small time 4-H stuff and, you know, the county fair and bringing, you know, just a fun little experiment on the side, if you will. But, you know, his founding story reminds me a lot of Dan Rather. For those of us from Texas, you know, Hurricane Carla in 1961 was Dan Rather's kind of crowning moment. He was a really young news reporter in the Houston, Galveston area. And when everyone else fled, he said, I'm going to stay and report this thing out. And, you know, the nation fell in love with Dan Rather because of this storm, because he was the one on the ground. They were enraptured by what was going on there. And he was the eyes and ears. And, you know, I mean, the rest is history, right? I mean, Dan Rather is one of the most respected men after Walter Cronkite in the world of news journalism. And, you know, Baxter Black had a similar moment in 1988 on a much smaller scale, NPR. But he noticed that there was not a lot of coverage of some fires that were going on throughout Yellowstone and the Western United States. And he was like, you know, the country needs to hear about this. And so he made a little video or a little audio recording and sent it in. And in his words, he literally just like somehow found the address to National Public Radio and addressed in the mail to National Public Radio and just sent it to DC to their office. Yeah.
That's a baller move, is all that is.
I know. Can you imagine the guy at the front desk just opens up like, what is this?
Yeah.
You know,
and then listening to it, going, wait a minute.
Yeah, I've worked for elected officials, and so I've sorted through very strange mail. And I swear that if I would have gotten some weird videotape, there's no way I would have even listened to it. It would have been straight to the trash can.
No.
So, I mean, this is, putting it all on the line to risk right here. But again, I mean, he probably didn't think it was that big of a deal, but it set off a 20-year career with NPR beginning in the 80s. And, he became a regular commentator for the morning edition, which, when I became of driving age in Oklahoma, my entire life, my parents listened to Sports Animal, which is our local sports radio show. And so when I became driving age, I've always been a nerd, always loved history. And I was so excited to be able to get in my car and listen to two things. And that was the local pop music channel and NPR, which, politics aside, I don't agree with them on everything. But the fact that I could like listen to something besides the sports, the Sooners fans calling in trying to get Bob Stoops fired, it was like there's a world outside of OU football. Oh my gosh, this is beautiful. And so, just the fact that he got on this show that, is so accessible to people. And that was one thing that he said, in his obituary on the NPR website, they acknowledged that he was not always friendly to them when it came to politics. Like he was not their demographic and
No.
he was not their guy, but he knew how important it was to share our lifestyle, the Western United States, share that to the rest of the world. And NPR knew that. They knew how important that was. And that's one of the reasons I've always respected NPR is they will at least put someone like Baxter Black on, give him that chance. And he got his own weekly syndicated radio program, which, was on since 1989. He had a syndicated column, which is probably what most people know him for, which is called On the Edge of Common Sense. And, that was picked up by hundreds of newspapers all over the country. But he, as Jay Ryan and I are trying to do, when someone called you the modern day Baxter Black, maybe you're not as eloquent. Maybe you don't love poetry as much. Maybe you don't put yourself in poetry, but you are, in the sense that you're hopping on what can be a very difficult and antagonistic platform and sharing, our way of life. I know that I tell my friends and family, I post a video of someone doing calf roping, and the comments on there are just not friendly sometimes. And
No.
you have to give it up to someone like Baxter Black for hopping on NPR and talking about some of the things that he talked about, which are realities in our world that someone who's driving to work in suburbs of New York or New Jersey probably has never even thought of.
No, and that was, and to me, that's what made Baxter great, is he was not scared to jump out there. And really the epitome of it is that, like you said, Baxter knew it was important that people learn about our way of life, and the fact that it was in trouble, that it was, I mean, let's just face it, in that time, that is the biggest thing the Western world had going for was Lane Frost. And Lane Frost brought a handful of people in. You had movies like Urban Cowboy that was bringing in a new demographic, but the actual way of life for the real working cowboy was dying.
Mm-hmm.
And Baxter brought that plight to a whole new market of people.
Yeah, it wasn't the urban cowboy roughneck, starched Wranglers and almost plastic cowboy hats. It was, the rough hewn realities of, getting up at the crack of dawn and, riding a hard day, getting out to the middle of nowhere, doctoring cattle. I mean, he did all of that in a comedic, or at least, refreshing way that even someone, like I said, who's driving to work in the suburbs can laugh about and think about, because you know what, it conjures those images that they saw with the Roy Rogers and
Yes.
Tom Mix and Hi-O Silver, like all these things. They're remembering all of that they saw as a kid, and it's being brought to them again in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s in a new way.
To me as a kid, there are two people on radio that brought joy whenever I heard them, and one being Baxter Black, and the other being, and the name was just, it just skipped right out of my head. That seems to always happen. Did God Made a Farmer.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Um, Never mind. It was there and then it was gone. Um, but those two, I can remember being little and going to work with my dad. My dad owned a small construction company, and I'd get bored on the job and go sit in the truck and turn the radio on. Paul Harvey.
Yeah. There you
And
go.
I would listen to Paul Harvey and we would listen to Baxter Black on NPR that morning. And that was my day. That was my day as a kid. And as a kid, being drawn in.
Yeah. By stories.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
because again, I was from a family that ran a construction company and had a few seed cattle and hated horses. So, that was my escape.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that little crossover episode, if you will, with Jay Ryan. If you want to hear how our conversation about Baxter Black and Buster Welch devolved into a little bit more of a historical discussion and had a little bit of fun, then go over to Jay Ryan's podcast channel, Behind the Horse's Eyes, and over there you'll hear the full interview. Really appreciate you guys listening in today. Please go check out his podcast. He has a great show, does it more consistently than I do, and really enjoy all the content he puts out. So go follow him on all of his social media as well. I will put that in the description of this video. But until next time, Godspeed and God bless.